One of the most useful applications of PHP is processing user input from an online form. In this chapter and the next, we'll take a deep dive into sending the contents of a feedback form to an email address. This is contact.php, which you can find in the chapter 9, 09_01 folder of the exercise files. It contains a simple HTML feedback form. What happens to the data in an online form depends on whether it's submitted using the post or get method. So let's begin by looking at the difference between the two methods. By default, forms are submitted using the get method, but it's common practice to specify which method you want to use by adding the method attribute to the opening form tag. So here on line 11, method has been set explicitly to the get method. The action attribute, which is also in the opening form tag, tells the browser where to send the data for processing. Usually this is the address of a script that checks the data and then handles it in some way or another, such as emailing it or inserting it into a database. My preference, though, is to add the processing script in a conditional statement above the doc type and execute the code only when the form has been submitted. This is what's known as a self-processing form, and it makes it easy to redisplay the form if there are any errors. Leaving the value of the action attribute empty results in the page reloading, and this was valid in HTML4, but in HTML5 the action attribute must always have a value. Now we could just type in the name of the page that the form is in, but PHP has a useful preset variable we can use instead. So between the quotes of the action attribute, I'm going to add the PHP shortcut for echo, and then inside there a variable. So we begin with a $, then an underscore, and all in uppercase, server. Then a pair of square brackets and quotes, and between those quotes also in uppercase PHP_self. And this will automatically include the path to the current file in the action attribute. Server is one of PHP's superglobal arrays, which are always available in any script. The names of all the superglobal arrays are always in uppercase, and with one exception, they all begin with an underscore. The server superglobal array gets information from the web server. It has a lot of elements, but not all of them are supported by every server. But this one, PHP self, is always available, and using this instead of hard coding the file name is useful because you never have to worry about changing its value if you rename your files. There are two other superglobal arrays that are useful when working with forms, and they take their names from the get and the post methods, and they capture the data that's submitted by the form. So let's use the post and get arrays. Let's inspect them. Down at the bottom of the form, between these two pre-tags, I'm going to add a PHP block and then a conditional statement. And I'm going to check the value of the get array. So if the get array has got any values in it, we'll echo content of the get array, followed by a line break. And then we'll use the printr function to inspect the content of that get array. We also want to check if the post array has got any values, so we'll check for post, and between those curly braces we want to do the same. Just copy that, paste that in there, and change get to post. It's very important when you're using the get and post arrays to make sure that you use uppercase. If you try to mix uppercase and lowercase or put it all in lowercase, it won't work. These variables, like all PHP variables, are case sensitive. The get and post arrays are always created by PHP, but they don't contain any elements if a form hasn't been submitted by the relevant method, and PHP treats an empty array as false. But if the form has been submitted using the get method, the get array will have values and will display those values. Otherwise, if it's been submitted using the post method, we'll display the values submitted by the post method. And if the form hasn't been submitted, neither of these will be executed. And both the get array and the post array use the name attribute of each form element to identify the value that's been submitted. So if we look at this form, the name attribute of the first input element is name, so it will be in the get array as name or in the post array as name. The next one is email, and the last one is comments. And it's very important that the name attribute of each input element in a form doesn't have any spaces in it. You can't have spaces. So let's save those changes and then view the page in a browser. Here is that contact form. Because nothing has been submitted, nothing is displayed down here. But if I fill in the fields and then a simple comment and then click the submit button, it now displays the content of the get array, and name is David, email is david@example.com. There are the comments. It also includes the submit button. So send is the name of the submit button and send comments is the value. That's the value that's displayed here. But notice also that at the end of the URL there is now a question mark, and those values have been appended to the end of the URL in what's known as a query string, and they're in name value pairs. So name equals David and email equals David, and then this %40 is a way of encoding in a URL the @ mark. Example.com, and then the comments, there are the comments, and also the name of the submit button. So when a form is submitted using the get method, all of the information is included in the URL. So let's go back to the editing program and see what happens when we send it using the post method. So change get to post, save that, go back to the browser. This time I will enter my name and leave out email and have a different comment, and then submit the form. And here is the content of the post array. See that name has been submitted. Email is submitted even though it doesn't have any value, so it's still part of the array. Would also be part of the get array if we were submitting using the get method, and then the comments and the value of the submit button. But notice the URL. Nothing is appended to the URL. There is no query string. Everything is sent with the headers of the page for processing. So that's the post and the get method. The post and get superglobal arrays capture the values that have been submitted by a form using the post and get methods respectively. The name attribute of each form element is used as the array key. Although the post array is used only with forms, the get array captures all name value pairs appended to the URL as a query string, so the values could also come from another source, such as name value pairs attached to the end of a URL in a link. As a general rule, the get method should be used only for search forms because the data is exposed in the URL and can be bookmarked. Use the post method for sending emails or for inserting records into a database. The advantage of using a self-processing form is that you can redisplay the form with error messages if any of the fields have errors or if required fields haven't been filled in. You need two arrays to deal with errors and missing fields. So let's begin by creating a PHP block at the top of the page above the doctype declaration. And inside that PHP block we need to initialize two empty arrays. So the first one will be called errors and the second one missing. We'll come back later to the script that processes the form input, but first let's add some error messages to the HTML form and wrap each one in a conditional statement so they're shown only when necessary. So immediately after the h1 tag on line 14, insert some space and we need a PHP block, and inside that PHP block we need to have a conditional statement. So if errors or missing, and I'm going to use the alternative syntax for conditional statements. So if either of these two arrays has any elements, they'll be true. Then we need to display a message which will be in HTML, be a paragraph with the class warning, and then we'll ask the user, please fix the items indicated. Then after that we need another PHP block. And because we're using the alternative syntax for conditional statements, we need the endif keyword followed by a semicolon. So this will be displayed only if there are any errors or anything is in the missing array. And if a user forgets to fill in a required field, the field's name will be added to the missing array. So for each label we need to add a conditional statement and an HTML span containing an error message. So on line 20, just before the closing label tag, insert some extra space. Then we need a PHP block, and in there a conditional statement. So if missing, so if the missing array has got any elements in it, this will be true, but we also need to check that this particular field is in the missing array. So and then we can use the inArray function to check whether a value is in an array. And what we're looking for is name. That's the first argument. And the second argument to inArray is the array that you want to check. So that's the missing array. If it is, we'll display a span. We'll give that the class warning. And then we'll ask the user to enter their name. And we just need to close off that conditional statement with another PHP block and the endif keyword followed by a semicolon. And let's just tidy that up. And the other labels follow exactly the same pattern. So we can copy these three lines, lines 21 to 23, and then paste them in the other labels. So just before the closing label tag on line 28, add some extra space, paste that code in. This time we're checking for email being in the missing array, and we'll change the error message to email address. And then on line 36, just before the closing label tag, some extra space, paste that in, and this time we're looking for comments to be in the missing array. And then we need to change that error message. So these error messages will be displayed only if the name of the field is in the missing array. So if we save that and then load the page into the browser, at the moment all of the error messages are hidden, but they'll be revealed if the processing script detects errors or required fields that have been left blank. So we'll look at creating that processing script next. We're using a self-processing form and have added error messages that will be displayed if there are errors or required fields have been left blank. Let's start building the processing script by making sure required fields are filled in. I've opened contact.php in the chapter 9, 09_03 begin folder of the exercise files. In the PHP block above the doctype declaration, we need to create a conditional statement that will execute code only when the form has been submitted. And if we scroll down to the bottom of the form, we can see that the name of the submit button is send. So that's what we need to look for. So after these two arrays have been initialized above the doctype declaration, we need to add a conditional statement, and we'll use the isSet function to see if post send has been set. If it has, we know the form has been submitted, so we'll execute the code. We need to start off with two arrays. One of them will list the names of the fields in the form, so that will be called expected. And at the moment we've got three fields: name, email and comments. The reason I'm creating this array is because even if you use JavaScript to validate user input in the browser, it's vital to check data submitted from an external source on the server with PHP as well. In fact, it's more important because it's trivially easy for a malicious attacker to bypass JavaScript validation. And we need this expected array because we're going to automate the way the post array is processed. And this adds to security because we'll only be processing the values that we expect and ignore any that might be injected by a potential attacker. The other array that I want to create is for the required fields, so I'll call that required. And we'll start off by having just two fields in there, name and comments. Now when processing a form, it's a good idea to put generic script in an external file. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new folder inside the begin folder and call it includes, and then inside there I'm going to create a page for my processing script. So that's a PHP file, and I'll call it process_mail.php. Then inside this new file we need a for each loop to go through the post array. So we're going through the post array as key. We also want the value, so we use the arrow operator and value. And the first thing I want to do inside the loop is to strip leading and trailing white space from the value using the trim function. This will prevent anyone from trying to skip a required field by pressing the spacebar several times. So we'll reassign the value back to value. Now currently the form's got only text input fields, but some form elements are submitted as arrays. So we'll use the ternary operator, and we'll also try to find out whether the value has been submitted as an array or not. So our condition will use the isArray function, and we pass it value to that. If it is an array, we simply reassign value back to the value variable, but otherwise we pass it to the trim function, which removes leading and trailing white space from strings. So the value is being passed to trim. Now let's pause before adding the next section of code, because I think that just looking at the code might be difficult to understand. I want to store the values of the post variables in simpler variables. The data from the three form elements will be submitted like this. Processing the data will be a lot easier if the values can be reassigned to simple variables like this. The way I'm going to do it is by using a PHP construction known as a variable variable, which creates a new variable dynamically. Let's say you've got a variable called key, and its value is name. To create a variable variable, you precede the original variable with another $sign and assign it a value. This creates a new variable that derives its name from the value of the original variable. In this case, the value of key is name, so $key creates a variable called name. So if key is email, it will create a new variable called email, and so on. So with that explanation out of the way, let's get back to the code. So we're looping through the post array, accessing both the key and the value of each array element. We've also trimmed leading and trailing white space from string values. So what we need to do is to find out if the value is empty and if the key is in the required array. So we'll do that with a conditional statement. If, then we can use the empty function, which tells you whether a variable has no value. So if empty value, and if it's in the required array, and in array we're looking for the key, that's the name of the input field, and we need to check the required array. If it is, we know we've got a required field that hasn't been filled in, so we need to add that to the missing array. So missing with an empty pair of square brackets after it, and then we assign the key, in other words the name of the form field, to it. And then we need to use a variable variable, so $signs and key, and assign it an empty string. So this will deal with required fields that are missing. But otherwise, if the key is in the expected array, we need to assign the value to a simpler variable. So else if, and then our condition will be in array. We're looking for the key again, but this time we're looking in the expected array. And if it is, we use a variable variable, $signs key equals value. So in both cases, a variable using the same name as the key will be created, but if a required field is blank, the value of the new variable is set to an empty string, and its key is added to the missing array. So that completes this part of this script. So let's go back to the main script in contact.php, and we need to include that. And it's an essential part of the script, so we need to use require, and we're inside the includes folder, and the file is called process_mail.php. So if we save both of those files and then load contact.php in a browser, we can now test our processing script. So if I just submit the form without inserting anything into any of the fields, we now get the error messages. Please fix the items indicated. We've got one for the name. There isn't one for email because that wasn't in the required array, but we have got one for comments. But if I now fill in something in name and submit, that one goes away, and we've still got the error message for comments. But if I fill in both name, so David, and just a quick comment there, and submit, all the error messages go away. So the processing script is beginning to take shape. There is a lot more to do with the mail processing script, but by looping through the post array and checking whether required fields have been filled in, we're now able to display appropriate error messages. You've also seen how to create a variable dynamically using a technique known as a variable variable. Let's just switch back to the editing program and take a look at that. It's in process_mail.php. A variable variable is created by adding two $signs in front of the variable name, and this creates a new variable that derives its name from the value of the original variable. In this case, we use the key of elements in the post array to create simplified variables and reassign their values to new variables. So post name becomes name, post email becomes email, and post comments becomes comments. This can be a difficult concept to grasp when you first encounter it, so take a moment to review this video to make sure you understand how the code works.